Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday mornings at 8:30, repeated again at 4:30 in the afternoon. Also, you'll find Wichita Liberty TV at my website. That's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. You'll find all the old episodes of Wichita Liberty TV there, along with show notes for each episode, and also all the other content at Wichita Liberty that I and others produce on almost a daily basis. So today I've got co-host Karl Peterjohn here, and I wanted to continue on. Last week we were talking about Century 2, and because that seems to be a pretty big topic of the day with the consultants report and everything. Some things we still need to talk about, but even before that, Karl, there's some breaking news this morning. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, that's part of the United States Department of Commerce, came out with the gross domestic product figures for metropolitan statistical areas, MSA, metropolitan areas, for 2016, just today. So these are figures year over year. And you know what? In real dollar terms, not inflation dollar terms, but real dollar terms, Wichita's GDP went down in 2016. It's 0.3% less in 2016 than it was in 2015. For the United States as a whole, actually, this is for all the U.S. metropolitan areas, so this doesn't include rural areas, but all metropolitan areas went up 3.2%. We contracted 0.3%. That's bad news, isn't it?
It certainly is, and two quick points. One, we're taping the show on Thursday, so there's not federal data coming out on a Sunday morning.
Right, that's right.
And secondly, the MSA for this area includes Sumner, Butler, and Harvey counties, which so we're talking about more than just Sedgwick County and Wichita.
But as you know, the focus now is this regional focus, and our economic development efforts, it's the greater Wichita partnership, and things like that.
Well, I think it's going to be it's a harbinger, I think, of more problems we're going to see, since we've now adopted the policy of big government states like New York and California, and we're going to tax our way to prosperity. That's the mantra from what's our left-wing media likes to call the moderate factions within the both the Democrat and Republican parties.
Referring to the tax increases passed this year in
the
Kansas.
Record-setting income tax increases, Bob, are going to be are negative in two ways. One, they're going to hurt existing businesses that are trying to operate and are trying to scramble now to take in the fact that they've got to come up with a year's worth of income tax withholding in 6 months. Plus, there's the uncertainty of how much more is going to be coming down the line in the future. We have no idea what the Black Robe Legislature, also known as the Kansas Supreme Court, will be seeking, and trying to read their oracle is about as productive as the Greeks had trying to read the Delphi oracle.
Even I think statewide, the current trajectories are that spending will be increasing faster than revenue is likely to, so we're likely to have some sort of deficit or something again. Now, the Wichita budget this year did not call for a tax increase. I mean, the manager wanted a tax increase for police, but that voted down.
Two things. One, that's the mill levy. And anybody who follows property taxes closely, and when you get your valuation statement in the spring, you can have a property tax increase even if the mill levy is decreased a little bit, which we tried to do because of valuation increases. As well as also, there's a dirty little secret in Kansas. And I'll make a confession, as an elected official, this was something that we did at the county level because we had to. State law mandated it. But we only passed a dollar amount budget. We didn't set the mill levy. And so what would happen is we'd pass a budget and say, okay, our mill levy, we plan to maintain the same level as last year, but it would be subject to technical adjustments and revisions. Well, if the valuations don't come in the way it's projected, you'd actually have an increase in the mill levy. And this is something that, for whatever reason, the local news media didn't want to talk about that. And over time, normally it's just a fraction of a mill. But over time, City of Wichita It's over $500,000
And
from
we're
what it was
talking
about
a
6 or
rate
7
of,
years ago.
a rate of taxation, not an absolute amount. So inflation doesn't figure into that. It's like a sales tax rate going up, so to speak. And speaking of that, it's not like the city of Wichita doesn't want to raise taxes. 3 years ago in 2014, the city wanted to implement a citywide sales tax. Now, as we'll talk about in a little bit, when we look forward to a new Century 2 or convention center or whatever, a temporary sales tax is an idea that's being floated. And of course, before your time on the Sedgwick County Commission, there was a temporary sales tax for, 30 months, I think it was, to raise the funds for the Interest Bank Arena.
Yeah, well, a little bit over $200 million, and it was a 2.5-year temporary tax, but there were a lot of whistles and bells, and we could get into details there, but I think it's more important to focus on the costs and the financing for any activity related to Century 2 changes.
And then one final note about the GDP before we take a break. Since 2010, I chose that year because that's really the first full year that we were out of the most recent recession. Wichita's GDP increased by 13.1%, but for all MSAs, 25.2. In other words, almost twice as much growth as Wichita experienced. And that is some really sad figures. Maybe we'll talk about those in a moment. Let's take our first commercial break here on Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, co-host Karl Peterjohn, talking about, we really need some good economic news, some economic growth here in Wichita, and that's maybe why our city leaders want to expand the Century 2 Convention Center part. We'll talk about the Performing Arts Center a little bit later, because that's really Century 2 is conventions plus performing arts, the symphony and things like that. But convention centers, they believe, you build the convention center, you're going to have all these visitors pouring in from across the country. They come, they use our airport, they use our restaurants, hotels, they go to Cowtown shopping, and maybe they really don't do that. We talked a little bit about Haywood Sanders last week. Here's his new book, just arrived today at my mailbox, Convention Center Follies. And he's done just tremendous research that shows that the convention centers are not really that good for economic growth. The centers themselves run at a huge deficit, but then we also have to have more hotel taxes and just on and on, all to generate more activities in hotels and restaurants. And it's just really not a very productive way to really grow the type of jobs that we'd like here in Wichita.
Well, one of the purposes of the downtown arena, when it was opened in January 2010, which is kind of your starting point, was the idea that that was going to be a focal point to help revitalize downtown. We set up a expanded TIF subsidy district to help facilitate it. We were hoping for more growth in and around the building, which really there's been a very limited amount, and we talked about the assessed value total. At least the taxable portion has not grown in any. In fact, the opposite trend has occurred. The not-for-profit side has had some growth, but the taxable side has not.
And just driving up and down Emporia streets and along the area there to the south and west of the arena, there's just empty lots and empty businesses. Nothing is happening there.
Well, but the pitch by proponents for the downtown arena was that this was going to help be a catalyst. And it had been originally part of some plans going back to the 1980s for redevelopment downtown. The challenge we have is to prioritize, and what is the best way that we can take resources in this community? And the question we have also is, should this be public or private? If it's public, how do we come up with them? Because one of the challenges we had at the county commission when I had the privilege of being on there was we had to meet the market in Wall Street in terms of how much money we would be allowed to borrow and not put our credit rating into jeopardy. And one of the criteria that we struggled with was the fact that total local government bonded indebtedness here in Sedgwick County, and that's not only including the county, but it's including the 20 municipalities, all the school districts, all the special districts and townships. We had basically too much local government debt, and Sedgwick County was able to overcome that in terms of being able to keep a very high credit rating. In fact, it is higher than the federal government's. But unfortunately, you've got other governmental bodies that don't have as high credit, so it costs more if you're going to finance it over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about these convention centers too, we opened this show talking about some fairly precise data that the government collects about gross domestic product in metropolitan areas. But Haywood Sanders in his book and in previous articles makes the point that you can get data about the number of airline passengers, auto sales, manufacturing orders, all this type of stuff. But for convention and trade show industry, the data is very scarce. And what data there is oftentimes self-reported by municipalities that want to make it look like they're doing a lot of business, both to other cities plus the taxpayers who paid for all this stuff. There really isn't that much good data on which to make a judgment as to whether these convention centers are really a net positive for an area.
That's a real problem with governmental involvement in these activities, Bob, because it has a tendency to get overlooked. And what can get measured can be managed. But if you're spending other people's money, that's one of the problems, because we're in a situation with the Interest Bank Arena that because of the way the revenue came in and the estimates, we were able to put together a fund to help handle capital costs.
And reserve fund, I think.
And then that reserve fund is being diminished. Mm-hmm. And even though it's significant, substantial, it's still well over $10 million. It's down significantly from when we first opened the facility. And if that trend continues, at some point, we're going to have to come up with additional funds to finance the operations. Mm-hmm. And that's a real problem, Bob, in the sense that a lot of governmental accounting doesn't really take depreciation into effect the way you'd have to do it in a private business. Mm-hmm. And so you can make the argument, and it's been made here locally, the city-owned Hyatt Hotel, back when it first opened, it had a positive cash flow before you would consider depreciation, and the city didn't consider depreciation.
Well,
but in the private sector, you'd be basically saying, hey, we're losing money.
Even the Sedgwick Account Arena, people like Dave Unruh and Tim Norton and others, they say, oh, the arena's already paid for. There's no need to consider its cost going in the future. But depreciation is meant to allocate the cost of a large, long-lived asset over the period that it's being used. And even though we didn't borrow money to build the arena, when a private company has an asset, even if they paid cash for it, they still calculate depreciation and use that both for tax and economic purposes. Karl, let's take another moment off for a commercial break. Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Well, welcome back to more Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks along with co-host Karl Peterjohn. Haywood Sanders talking about convention centers, he brings up the fact that the consultants for convention center boosters, of course, who have a vested interest in getting these things built and telling cities what they want to hear, they'll make forecasts like this when in the reality might be more down here. And a critic of Sanders said, well, it's not really that we should compare and judge the convention centers by did they meet the performance. We should compare them to what would happen if the convention center had never been built or expanded. So they don't even care really that these forecasts are not anywhere near based on reason.
Well, if you have unrealistic expectations going in, the taxpayers are going to take it in one form or another in the long run. Mm-hmm. The challenge, I think, is twofold. You've got the capital side, Bob, but then you've got the operational end. And the city's been operating Century 2 for a long period of time. The county went with a different model where we basically contracted out. Right. We went with SMG to operate the Interest Bank Arena. And frankly, I think that brings more accountability into the operations. Now, there can be problems there too, and frankly, there's a whole host of different models. We've got a privately owned facility, Hartman Arena, that's operating up in Park City, and that would be the most private of the options, and city-owned and operated would be the most governmentally controlled option.
But there are a lot of private venues that are springing up where you can have parties, you can have small business meetings and things like that are privately owned too.
Yes, quite a few here in town, and
yeah,
and
all the time they're new.
And they range from facilities that would handle maybe less than 200 people up to, well, Century 2 handles about 5,000, but you've got quite a jump there from the 5,000 to get up to 15,000 roughly that you can max out at Interest Bank Arena.
You know, the Arup, the consultant that presented in Wichita last week, talked about, as expensive as these projects are, they talked about the history of cost overruns in the traditional DBB way of building large, complex projects. That stands for, well, something or other, but it's the usual way that things are done.
DB
Design,
means
build, and anyway.
I was thinking Davis-Bacon, but because if it's a federal project, that is a different factor, and on construction
Labor
projects,
costs,
it's more expensive.
But they did a study of projects over $100 million in cost, so fairly substantial things like the Century 2 would be. And they found average cost overruns of 55% for brownfield projects and 39% for greenfield projects. Now, brownfield in this case would be remodeling, refurbishing a building like Century 2. That is kind of risky because, you know, who knows what's behind all those walls in there. Greenfield would be building a building on, you know, vacant land or, you know, from scratch.
But there are risks with either one of those two models, Bob.
Well, 39% overruns for greenfield.
I think it makes me feel better in terms of how the construction of the Interest Bank Arena was handled, because it did come in within projections, and there were a lot of good people involved, and the whole process is one that you could have huge problems with overruns.
Yeah.
And we didn't with the Interest Bank Arena.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Now, Century 2, besides Convention Center, is a performing arts center. Now, so this, we're talking about the large symphony hall, the is that where the big music theater, Wichita Broadway productions are in the summer? There's also the smaller Mary Jane Teal Theater. I think those are the two most prominent facilities there that we're talking about there. And they want to revamp those at, you know, cost of a lot of money. And the problem I have with this, Karl, is that the people who go to the symphony, and you know I love the symphony, Karl. I play the piano, you know, classic, and study that. These people that go to these types of events are generally pretty well at the higher end of the economic spectrum. They're fans of highbrow art. They can afford symphony tickets and theater tickets, even if the cost was not subsidized by the general taxpayer.
Well, that's always a challenge, because in government it's a difficulty in terms of trying to pick out pricing points, because if you don't have a marketplace for whatever good or service you're providing, it goes into a political realm, and then all bets are off.
And we do have a lot of arts that are done through philanthropy. You know, right now at 13th and Rock Road, the Mark Arts Center is being finished. Michael Garvey is doing something with the building that is being vacated for that new building. And so things can happen on their own. And
well, and the city of Wichita has a dedicated portion of the city mill levy that goes to the arts.
Yeah. And when you think about lowbrow arts, now I want to be clear here that I'm not talking about, you know, I mean, lowbrow arts would be considered popular movies and popular concerts. But look at, we have the Warren Theaters in Wichita, which are world class. Bill Warren did receive some subsidies from the governments, but nothing on the order like we're getting ready to do for Century 2. Paul McCartney concert in a government-owned building. I mean, people who can
Interest
afford,
Bank Arena, let's be clear.
Yeah. They
it wasn't like
that.
they were holding it down in the county commission chambers.
Yeah. What if we had a really lowbrow thing? I'm thinking that what Janet Miller and people like that would think is lowbrow, something like motorsports or mud trucking or something like that. Shooting sports, for example. Should we subsidize those things? Karl, hold on to your answer to that as we take another commercial break. And when we come back, we'll get Karl on the spot to see if he thinks the city should subsidize mud trucks and shooting races. How about that? Well, welcome back to this final segment of Wichita Liberty TV for this week. I'm your host, Bob Weeks, with co-host Karl Peterjohn. So, Karl, we were talking about how governments subsidize highbrow art, make everybody pay for that, but lowbrow arts, popular music, mud trucks and so forth like that, shooting sports, people who do that have to pay themselves.
Well, yes and no. I mean, monster trucks, we've had them at the Interest Bank Arena, and we've had the circus there, and they often serve bread, so you can make the argument with bread and circuses too.
Yeah, there you go.
And I don't know if that would be much more lowbrow than where we're going there. The intent
and we're not disparaging these people,
and
but
I
we're
am
talking
not.
about popular
Interest Bank Arena
activities versus highbrow stuff.
at the county level. At the county commission, we were interested in not only having a facility for the community that it could be used for a variety of activities, but hopefully it would pay for itself, at least operationally, since they didn't have the capital cost because there was no financing. It had been covered with the 2.5-year 1 cent sales tax.
And considering the operations only of Interest Bank Arena, they do generate a little bit of positive cash flow. Is that right?
Well, there have been some years where they have. The last year that was most memorable with positive cash flow was the year when we had Garth Brooks come in, had a whole series of very successful, and I can't remember if he did 3, 4, maybe even 5 concerts
5 days or something,
over several days. And we actually had, at the end of the year, they brought a check down to the county commission. But if you look at the details, and you get your green eye shade out, Bob, when you factored in depreciation, even that year we still ended up in a negative financial position once you factor in depreciation. But we did have a positive cash flow, and that's a positive. Most of these facilities don't.
Right.
And that's been the big problem with Century too.
And I think SMG, the private sector company that manages the arena and shares in that profit, if there is at the end of the year.
Well, I'd say positive cash flow.
Yeah. They don't really have to bear capital costs. For example, they wanted to build a better entrance to the north side of the arena. Did they pay for that, or who did pay for that?
Well,
Karl?
that came out of the reserve fund. It's going to be one of the areas where I think there needs to be accountability and closely monitored. The arena downtown was really designed to bring in an NC2A regional. That's going to happen in the not too distant future. There's a lot of very justifiable excitement
6
about
months
it.
from now or so.
The question will be is, will the revenues that are generated from that be justified when measured against the costs that have been made to have that event occur?
And it's a good thing to have all those people here, but we hosted those same tournaments at the Kansas Coliseum in the past, and we're talking 3 days, 4 days worth of basketball games?
Yeah, I think it's 4 days worth of basketball
for
games
the early
at most.
rounds at one site there.
Yeah.
So, and they talk about every year Wichita State Shockers play one basketball game downtown at the Interest Bank Arena, and they talk like that's a breakthrough in economic development as well.
Well, whether it's Wichita State or I know K-State's been down there, and whatever teams they're able to bring in, the team itself isn't the important thing. I think the real critical side of it is how does it work as a whole. So when you add up not only the basketball side of it, but we've got the Thunder hockey, we've got the concerts, we've got every other activity that's down there. And it is a community center in that sense. The question is there a better way to deliver that? And should we look at that as the model as opposed to we've had other folks going down on a different venue, and facilities out there like Park City are in effect competing in many ways with Century too.
Right. And that is one thing. We're speaking about the convention center part of a new Century Tour or whatever. The city manager did say perhaps it could be run by a private sector entity. We don't know, nothing was specific, so it could be similar to what the county's done with SMG and the arena or something else, but the more private sector, I think, the better off we could possibly be.
Well, there's different models for doing it. When I look at the entertainment venues that we have here in town, and SMG's been involved with more than just the arena, the Orpheum Theater. And we need to look at trying to maximize the value for our public funds, or return them to the private sector and let them try and develop it. We started this show, Bob, talking about how we've had some bad news from the latest government statistics. I'm hoping that if energy prices come back to where they've normally been, if the ag sector continues to have at least good crops and reasonably decent prices, and we can bounce back of the aircraft and aviation and aviation in general, we'll be in a position that we can turn that negative trend around. I'm very much concerned that with our ability by governments to raise property taxes and the state's inability to control their budgets and massively increase taxes, and they could raise property taxes too, in terms of the mill levy, we're looking at a very cloudy future.
Well, just in closing, a couple of weeks ago we presented some statistics about how since the recession the number of people working in the Wichita area has barely increased, but the labor force has really fallen by quite a bit. That's why our unemployment rate looks pretty good. But when you look about GDP growth, that's the total worth of all the stuff people in Wichita did for a year, that's been shrinking, and that can't be good news at all. So, Karl, we're just flat out of time for today. Yeah. So thank you, Karl, for being here today with your insight. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week.